I asked her, I said, why were they so rough on the women? And she said they wanted to provoke the men. But the women of January 6th were, to a woman, all of them had rough either upbringings or rough uh, progression through life. So, they were the kind of women that country songs are written about. The heartening part of the story is that none of them broke. None of them said, "Gosh, what fools we were to go to Washington. What we were so deceived. The election was free and fair. How did we not see that? No, that didn't happen." None of them renounced their affection for Trump. Well, I would say that liberal women are the victims of sort of advanced feminism, and so they're taught that they're a species apart. Whereas the conservative women are much better integrated into the life of their family.
Jack Cashill has authored more than a dozen books and collaborated on another 20. He's written about everything from Obama's presidency to the Clinton body count. Today, he's here to discuss his most recent book, Ashli, The Untold Story of the Women of January 6th. It reveals not only the untold story of Ashli Babbit, but also the many other intrepid women who came to Washington, D.C. for one simple reason: to demand the Jacobin elite give back their freedom. Stay tuned and hear the story of January 6th, the media doesn't want you to know.
For show and tell purposes.
Perfect. My first question for you is just what made you look at January 6th, everything that was going on, and say, I want to focus on what the chicks are doing? What made you think I need to investigate what was going on with the women?
Well, actually, I wanted this. My initial goal was to tell the story of Ashli Babbit, the woman who was most famously shot and killed. There were two women killed that day, but she was the one who was best known. And but then I realized that if I wanted to tell her story and what motivated her, given the scant about information we have about her, and that she's put in paper, it's not like in the 19th century everyone had diaries and they wrote letters and there was troves of information about them. Now there's a few, tweets. I mean, is what you're down to. So I wanted to flesh out the picture. I decided to talk about not just why Ashli went, but why women in general went, why they participated. Because usually when we see images from January 6th, we see guys, we see men. And the men are usually the ones in the forefront of the pushing and shoving. So I thought I'd round out the picture. And I chose two women purposefully. That was Ashli Babbit and Roseanne Boylan, both of whom were killed that day. And then the other 8 I chose more or less randomly. I didn't know any of them. I had no contact with any of them. And but they all seemed to have kind of interesting stories. None of them, I would say this, the one qualifier was that none of them simply pled guilty, took their 3 years probation, and walked away. All of them had something going on that made them interesting. And of the 8 who survived, all 8 were eventually incarcerated.
Okay. Kind of touching on the women that were there. In the book, you noted that women fared way worse on the scene of the Capitol, like really getting knocked around and punched more than the men.
Yes.
But the men ended up getting longer sentences and kind of faring worse in the criminal justice system.
Correct.
Why do you think that happened? It seems to go against nature for even a cop to shove women around harder. Do you think it's just a problem within policing system? They're just brutality has gotten out of control, or were women just more vulnerable and easier to push around, so they just went wild?
Well, I would say my instinct would be to say they're easier to push around and you get a little more instant gratification if you're a bully. But one woman offered I thought, a very interesting opinion. And her case proves it out. Her name is Victoria White. And she was beaten bloody by the Metropolitan Police Department. And, like 20, 30, 40 times over the head and face. And I asked her, I said, why were they so rough on the women? And she said they wanted to provoke the men, right? So, and that's true in Victoria White's case because the guy who comes to her defense gets 6 years in prison.
Okay, I'm glad I asked. That makes perfect sense. That would kind of
rile
up at least conservative men.
Right. The Daniel Penny phenomenon,
You mentioned in the book that kind of to go back to Trump, because that's why everybody was there for the election fraud, that when they came for the Pussygate and the tape, and they wanted to say that Trump, hated women, he was a misogynist. You brought up that Reince Priebus said Trump should drop out because he would lose in the biggest landslide. But you
Right.
very poignantly say that Trump understood women better than rhinos. And I was just kind of wondering, why do you think that's the case? Especially since Trump is a womanizer. He's a cad. I mean, I voted for him in 2016. It didn't really bother me that much, but that's what he is. He's a man, and he's rich, and he can pretty much do what he wants to women. Why do you think that didn't matter overall to the rest of the women?
And this I did not expect to find. When we think of Republican women, we tend to think of, safe, secure, married, suburban, soccer momish types, right? But the women of January 6th were, to a woman, all of them had rough either upbringings or rough progression through life. So, they were the kind of women that country songs are written about. Many of them had been divorced. Several of them had children out of wedlock. Ashli Babbit was born out of wedlock. And yet they all were living decent middle-class lives. And so when Trump is accused of his misbehavior, which is by bourgeois standards, yeah, sure, he misbehaves, but that is not uncommon among men of a certain income and power level. They get it. They've seen it. It doesn't like, oh my goodness, they don't, there's far less, eye rolling and gasping and pearl clutching at the notion that men might betray them, because they've been through it, and they've been on both sides of it. They've been the betrayers, as well as the betrayed. So they understand human nature better, basically. That's my reading of it. And I was able to, and I was really pleased to do this. I was surprised, secure the cooperation of all 8 of the living women.
Oh, so you got to speak with them and talk with them for the book? And
in some cases, it was just, through prison letters or brief prison conversations. But yeah, I communicated with all 8 of them.
What was their take now, 4 years later? Do they regret going in the Capitol? Would they have done it if they'd known they would have been in prison that long? Because I don't think anybody thought, I'm going to go to January 6th and get a felony and do that. Would they be like, yes, I would still do it all over again? Or would they maybe go, pump the brakes a little bit?
The heartening part of the story is that none of them broke. None of them said, gosh, what fools we were to go to Washington. We were so deceived. The election was free and fair. How did we not see that? No, that didn't happen. None of them renounced their affection for Trump. In some cases, and I'll give you the most obvious example. I just got a message from her the other day, Rachel Powell. She was sentenced to 4.5 years in prison for breaking a window, right? She's the mother of 8. She's only about 40 years old, or early 40s now. And she said, yes, I was foolish to break that window. I shouldn't have done that, right? But she didn't regret going to Washington. She regretted breaking the window because of the effect it's had on her family. She did not expect to go to prison for 4.5 years. And as she says, the prison where she's assigned, I believe it's in West Virginia, is a total hellhole. She can't believe how bad it is and how bad her circumstances are. And, a lot of the guys toughened up in prison. I think it's a little harder for the women to do that.
Yeah, I would think so. I don't even want to think about being in prison. I often wonder, given that Republicans and conservatives are typically the more tough on crime, put people in prison and throw them away, and Democrats and liberals tend not to be that way, if this is going to shake up the Republican Party and make them think differently about the criminal justice system, because now our president's a felon. Now we've had people realize maybe the criminal justice system is a little bit rigged against certain people. I mean, I would like to see a little bit softer approach on crime. Do you think that'll happen with the party?
Well, I certainly like to see a fairer approach on crime. Courtney, one of the the maddening things about this whole ordeal is that, for instance, during the Kavanaugh hearings, hundreds of women were arrested for disrupting an official proceeding, literally. Mm-hmm. That was a charge that was thrown out for many of the J6ers. They'd go into the hearing room while the hearing was in session, kick up a fuss. They'd have to be dragged out by the Capitol Police, right? Arrested. And their punishment, 30 to 50, finish that sentence. Not days in jail, not years in prison, but $30 to $50 fine, right? Now, for the same crime, there are J6ers serving 3 to 5 years.
It's barbaric. When you were talking with these women over the years, did they ever express frustration that Trump didn't pardon them in the last 2 weeks of administration? Because I thought that was a huge failure. I was quite disappointed that he just walked out the door and didn't really do anything.
Well, most of them were not arrested until after January 20th. It was the rare. I only know of the 8 women, only one of whom was arrested before January 20th, 2017. I don't think he was anticipating what happened to happen. Yeah. And the woman who was arrested, this is interesting because it's a pretty classic case. If you just want the one test case of what happens, this woman works for the Cleveland School District as an occupational therapist. She's divorced, mother of one grown daughter, about 50. She goes on a bus with her friends to Washington. She's a big pro-lifer, and she's also animated by the cause of child trafficking. So she goes and walks in alone wanders around the Capitol like everyone else, goes in through an open door. She's holding a sign that says something like, protect all our children, right? She's photographed, takes a picture of her in the Senate chamber, empty. That appears in the paper. And that next day, several of her colleagues rushed to the FBI to identify her, right? And the FBI shows up at her house in the morning of January 8th. I mean, it's freezing, it's Cleveland, and drag her out and arrest her 2 days after the fact, right? She's sentenced to 11 months in prison for her crime, right? The first 2 weeks, she's sent to the Hole, the secure housing unit, solitary confinement. But given the overcrowding, she has to share it with an inmate who just happens to be a man pretending to be a woman, right? And she said it was a nightmare. And I've met her since, talked to her. I mean, I've met her in person since, and sweetheart, nicest lady, spent 11. And then she got out after, I believe, 7 months. And partly, but back to your question, because of the law passed by President Trump about the early release law, whatever it was called. I don't remember.
The First Step Act, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, First Step Act, right. And, but she said life in the general population wasn't a whole lot better than life in the Hole. And they all have that mark. Now she's a felon. She can't get a job, right? She can't work, live in the school district. It's been very difficult for her. She's living in the basement of her mother's home. This is what the left fails to see, it chooses not to see, is the destruction of the whole network, the fabric of these people's lives. They're scrambling at the end of the day. Many of them are jobless. Many of them have no future, and all for exercising their First Amendment right to assemble and protest.
It's kind of scary because it makes someone like me not even ever want to go to a rally or a protest because I'm afraid, what if they want to rig some sort of event like January 6th again, and then I'm going to end up in the slammer just for merely being there? Do you think this is going to silence Trump supporters over the next 4 years or even after Trump is out of office to kind of keep quiet?
Well, according to that, it certainly was their intention. They wanted to make it so that large crowds would never again assemble for Donald Trump. However, as we saw on the campaign trail, that didn't work out so well. When you see like open events, just talking to a friend of mine who went to the Trump rally at Wildwood on the New Jersey shore, where they have this big old beach and you can fit as many people as you like. There are 100,000 people there, you know? So, however, I will say this, is they're not going back to Washington. They're not going to protest there. And, just watching that, you must have seen the Trump's Meet the Press interview with, was it Kristen Welker? And she says, she's talking about whether they'll be pardoned. She goes, but hundreds of them pled guilty, right? And Trump tries to explain why that was so. He didn't do it very precisely. But the reason they pled guilty is because they were going before juries, 95% of whom voted against Donald Trump, right? Not a single person who went before a D.C. jury was acquitted. When they go to trial, they're given longer sentences. And so they had no choice. I mean, the choice for accepting a plea deal was either, maybe a year in prison or 20 years in prison or 10 years in prison. And the ones who did accept plea deals, and I've talked to several of them, did so very reluctantly, against their better instincts. I mean, a classic case is the case of Dr. Simone Gold, who I also profile. And I've gotten to know Simone pretty well. She and her bodyguard, her beau/bodyguard, John Strand, did same thing. She had a permit to speak on the Capitol steps, got swept in through the open doors when the crowd surged. So she gave her speech inside, in the rotunda, stood on the base of a statue for 5 minutes, spoke, then was ushered out by the police. She and John was with her the whole time. Simone is running a major medical operation, can't afford, years in prison, so she takes the plea deal. And just for what there's no violence, no broken doors, windows, anything. Just for what I just described, she's sentenced to 2 months in a maximum security facility in Miami, right? Now, her beau, Strand, is a really very sincere, devout Christian. And he believes that, a sin to testify against yourself, to bear false witness against yourself. So he was not going to plea to doing things he did not do, like disorderly conduct or whatever. So he goes to trial in D.C., and he gets 2.5 years in prison. So that was the dilemma people were facing. Do I take the 2 months or the 2.5 years?
I don't know what I'd do in that circumstance. It'd be tempting to just say you did it to get out of prison.
Well, and a lot of it depended on what responsibilities you had on the outside, In Strand's case, he was single. I mean, no one was depending on him. And in a sense, he had some flexibility. Whereas with Dr. Gold, and they're together. I mean, they're partners. She knew she had a larger responsibility, this whole network that she had created. She was the founder of America's Frontline Doctors. And, by that time it had become, kind of a major enterprise.
Okay. I kind of want to go back to the 2 women that died and talk about them for a minute. I didn't realize that Roseanne Boylan died. I thought only Ashli Babbit was the only person that died that day. For some reason, I guess, I don't know, maybe I wasn't paying attention enough, or I don't really think the media always told the full story, of course. But the official cause of her death was medical circumstances for Roseanne Boylan.
Yeah, the official cause was amphetamine overdose, something like that. It had the word amphetamine in it. Not methamphetamine, just amphetamine, something or another. So they wrote it off to natural causes. And there's a long story here that as her treatment at the hands of the police was arguably worse than Ashli Babbitt's. Roseanne had been a drug user. although she comes from a very good family, has loving sisters, she, when she was young, she just got into bad habits, bad friends, ended up spending 10 years on probation. And so the first time she was able to vote was in 2020. And her father, who is sympathetic, said he's never seen her happier because she fell in with the Trump crowd at some point in the later years of the last year of her life. And so she went to Washington with her beau, a guy named Justin Winchell. They, they go to the Capitol. Just they're in the crowd, just like everyone else. And what happens is you get caught in a crowd like this, especially if you're a female and you're not very big, and you don't have control of where you're going. You go where that crowd pushes you. And we know, too, there are people in that crowd pushing purposefully towards, with the goal of causing provocation or confrontation with the police. She gets caught in that crowd. She ends up in the entrance to this one tunnel that was very vigilantly guarded. I mean, so this is 2 hours after Ashli Babbitt's been killed. 2 hours, and after a half a dozen different doors are wide open, and police are escorting people around inside the Capitol. They're guarding this tunnel entrance like it was the friggin' Alamo. And she gets caught in the mouth of that tunnel. Then the police decide to spray in this very enclosed space, using OC gas or pepper spray or with a mace. And people start passing out. And then the police make a concerted surge, push her down this flight of steps. She ends up at the bottom of the pile, and she's suffocating. There's a young black guy who was holding her hand when they fell, and he almost died. And that's how, and he was fit. And Roseanne was sort of out of shape, overweight. But they pull her, the protesters pull the rest of the crowd off. She's lying there at the tunnel entrance. And this is caught on video. A policewoman walks up to her and starts thrashing her over the top of the head with a branch that had been thrown up there. It hit her so hard on the third swipe that the branch broke in half, right? A month later, that officer, Lila Morris, is sent to the Super Bowl to be honored for her heroism, right? They totally buried the death of Roseanne Boylan. And they sat on the autopsy as long as they could for 90 days. And then when they finally released it, they said, it was some sort of amphetamine overdose due to her taking Adderall for her ADHD, right? And her family was horrified because the last thing they knew Roseanne would want is to be identified as a drug user who died of drug use because she had been clean for 2 years. And what I think happened is that the medical examiner, or his office, Washington D.C, was entirely complicit, knew her history and figured that they could sell this as the cause of death. Inexplicably, or not inexplicably, but partly out of naivete, the two sisters who are liberal, and her husband of one of them, knew an anchor at MSNBC, and they contacted him, Moyadeen, and he did a 5-part podcast on the death, expecting his goal was to find out what evil forces, seduced poor Roseanne into becoming a Trump supporter, QAnon and all that. Instead, what he found out was that the family and MSNBC were being stonewalled at every turn by the medical examiner's office in D.C., by the Capitol Police, by everyone. They wouldn't share, body cam footage, wouldn't release the report. So MSNBC ended up hiring their own forensic analyst to do a sort of pathology report. And this woman said, no, it's obvious how she died. She got caught in this crowd. She got gassed. She got pushed to the bottom of the pile. She suffocated. And then she got beaten after she got pulled out. It had nothing to do with drug use, right? But for 95% of the American public doesn't know that. So they could just say, oh, Roseanne Boylan, she was a druggie, a drug overdose, blah, blah, blah. Write it off altogether. Her family was horrified, not only by their treatment at the hands of the deep state, but by the failure of MSNBC to pursue this once MSNBC realized it wasn't going down the rabbit hole they hoped it would.
Oh, wow. Well, it smelled like a cover-up. That's kind of what it seemed like to me. I'm going to ask you a question now. You might need to put your tinfoil hat on for this one. It's going to sound a little crazy about Ashli Babbit. This would be back about 3.5 years ago, so about 6 months after January 6th. Yeah. Spent too much time on the internet, and some people were speculating that Ashli Babbit actually didn't die that day, or that it wasn't Ashli Babbit, it was somebody else's body, and she's still alive. What do you have to say to people that go so far down the rabbit hole, it gets insane?
I've seen those, Courtney, and I wish the word crisis actor had not been entered into the vocabulary. And I would just say to them, talk to Ashley's mother, right? You want to, just like Alex Jones and Sandy Hook, you can't say that these were crisis actors when people have lost their children, right? If they are crisis actors, and if this was staged, you better be damn straight. You got it, your facts right, because otherwise, not only is it a potentially, you set it yourself up for legal slaughter, but you also, it's inhuman. It is just immoral to suggest to a parent that her daughter wasn't really killed without any evidence other than your own, fixation on being the guy on your block with the inside knowledge that no one else has. And you see a lot of that. I'm accused of being conspiracy theorist all the time. But what bugs me is that there's a group. It's actually not a psychosis, but it's a neurosis. The need to be the person who knows something no one else knows. And what you know is more extreme than anyone would possibly believe, And I get into these discussions periodically, and these people give me a harder time than the people on the left who are just ignoring and refuting the obvious facts.
Oh, really? That's funny.
Yeah.
I always assume theories like that kind of come from the same place that QAnon came, which I believe is the government. FBI, CIA, pick your 3-letter agency. I figure those type of things are just started by the government to get people fighting and confuse them, distract from the real story.
Well, QAnon, curiously, and researching this story, I could not avoid QAnon because what the media would do is, even if these women had the vaguest, slightest interest in QAnon, the day after January 6th, when the New York Times announces the death of Ashli Babbit, they described her as a Trump supporter and QAnon fanatic, right? Mm-hmm. She wasn't a QAnon fanatic. QAnon, for most people, is like reading their daily horoscope. What's our fortune cookie? Wisdom. What's the world like today? And I had always disregarded QAnon, and I didn't know what it was until I got started doing this research for this book, and I figured I couldn't ignore it, so I investigated it. And I will say this: there's more there than meets the eye. QAnon, I would say its core thesis is probably best summed up in the word Pizzagate. And that is that there is a cabal, a high-level cabal of movers and shakers that are that have a pedophilia network, among the high and mighty. The one Pizzagate derives from the emails of John Podesta. They were hacked, or they were swiped by Julian Assange's followers. Personally, I believe Seth Rich was involved, but that's another story. And when you read the Podesta emails, hi, Joe, come on over tonight. We're going to have a piece of pizza. I mean,
Yeah, a little weird.
It's hard not to see what they are talking about. And then in recent years, months, you see the busting of P. Diddy now, and
Yeah.
Jay-Z seems to be involved in this, and these large-scale grooming pedophile operations. The Nickelodeon guy, totally busted. The guy Keith Raniere, who was his I don't know if you know about Keith Raniere, sex trafficker, underage children and adult women, sex slaves, all kinds of bizarre stuff. But two of his chief henchmen were the Bronfman sisters, whose father Edgar is like the biggest mega donor in the Democratic Party. These people hang together, and we know now that Jeffrey Epstein, that this stuff is going on. It's not far-fetched.
Yeah.
So it deserves to be looked at. But for, QAnon was like, in 2020, what Project 2025 was in 2024, was something that the Democrats latched onto to explain the irrationality of their opposition.
This is going to sound kind of crazy going back this far, but wasn't Andrew Breitbart, I remember like not long before he died, kind of trolling Podesta that he knew something about him, that he was like creepy. I remember this video of him running around like giving him a hard time, and then he died not too long later. Do you think it was he knew something about what Podesta was up to, possibly, allegedly, in those emails? And that's what, because I think Andrew Breitbart was murdered, but that's just Courtney's opinion. Do you think there's any connection there, or have you not looked into it?
I don't know, because, the emails didn't surface until 2016, and Breitbart died in 2012.
Yeah, but maybe he knew something, like sniffed
Breitbart
it out.
Knew a lot.
Yeah, and, I think he got himself killed.
And I don't disregard that he was murdered. I would not rule that out. And yet, I met Andrew a few times. In fact, once he defended me on the Bill Maher show. I was very pleased with that. But he, as everyone who knew him well said, he was burning candles at both ends. He was totally engaged. And yet, the nature of his death, where the guy who saw him die in that L.A. street corner, I guess, said that he turned bright red and then passed out. But the people I know who've witnessed heart attacks say the person turns gray, not red. So who knows? I wouldn't rule it out at all. He was such an influence on our side of the aisle. He was such a dynamic character, so valuable in so many ways.
Yeah, you kind of saw the future of politics before anybody else did. It's down. Yes. What do you say? Politics is downstream from culture, or something like that. Like, you definitely saw it was coming on long before it happened.
Right. In fact, the podcast I do is called Upstream, in honor of his exact quote. We go upstream to where the culture formulates the politics that come downstream.
That's cool. That's really cool. Sorry, we kind of got way off the topic of your book.
No, let me flash my book up here, Ashli.
Definitely flash it.
The woman of January 6th.
I wanted to ask you again, a little bit more specific. In your book, you had mentioned that the women that came for January 6th were indistinguishable from the men in their lives, that unlike the women that came with the pussy hats in 2017 were all about reproductive health and me, a women's issue. What do you think it is about liberal women and conservative women that it's kind of liberal women go for women's issues only, and maybe conservative women have these genderless issues they care about that have nothing to do with their anatomy, their biology? It's a stolen election, which affects everybody. What do you think makes that happen and split like that?
Well, I would say that liberal women are the victims of sort of advanced feminism. And so they're taught that they're a species apart. They don't need, what's her name said? They need men like a fish needs a bicycle. Who said that? An Australian lady, I forget her name. Not Gloria Steinem, maybe, I don't know, maybe one of them. And so, whereas the conservative women are much better integrated into the life of their family. So their issues, the reason these women came to Washington were the same issues men did, as you say, free and fair elections, rule of law, preservation of the Constitution. The women who went to Washington in 2017, remember the big pink hat, protest, which were much more violent than anything that happened at the Capitol. They had a laundry list of their own issues, starting with reproductive rights. Well, no one, not since Buck versus Bell in 1927, has the government tried to tell women that they cannot reproduce. They can reproduce all they want, right? No one is restricting their ability to reproduce, right? They have reproductive. They have 100% reproductive rights. The women who went to January 6th, the high profile, many of them had been reproducing a lot. Rachel Powell has 8 children. Several. Among them, they had many more children, many more grandchildren. On the left, right now, when leftist women reach a certain age, they're looking around at their conservative friends and saying, "How come I don't have any grandchildren?" Right? Because maybe you had a child or 2 children, and that child said, "I'm going to become a guy," or "I don't want to have children." There is a real birth deficit on the left, so they have to steal our children, which is they've been doing for a long time. But no, they're not integrated. They see themselves as a race apart, as a sex apart. Men as an enemy, or as an adversary, someone to be jumped over, climbed over, or to be complained about. Now, the women on our side may complain about men, but it's usually for more specific things, like, where was that creep until 3 a.m.? Not like, why is he getting a job I'm not getting? Because the jobs their husbands have are, going out at 3 a.m. because of broken power lines or plumbing leaks or whatever. They're jobs that they don't want to do, right?
So liberal women kind of live in a bubble of their own insanity from advanced feminism.
Right. I will say this, though. This is kind of interesting because it rarely enters into our side of the equation. I had a blowout the other day. So I have AAA card. I say, I'm not going to, these are new tires. I saw how they put them on. I'm not going to be able to get these tires off. So I call AAA and they send a woman out, right? Now it's a little embarrassing for me because they send a woman out to change my tire, right? But she couldn't change it.
You're kidding me. What was she doing there? Gosh.
And she had all the tools, all those fancy tools and stuff. Couldn't change it. So she was embarrassed then at that point, So I had a call for a tow truck, and the guy comes with the tow truck, and this is all covered by AAA. It's a good organization, by the way. So he said, I explained what happened last night. He came the next morning. He said, I can do that. I said, no. I said, take it down. You're here. I need a new tire anyhow. Let's go down to Firestone and get this figured out. So anyhow, that is why, part of the reason why we understand our lanes better on our side of the aisle.
I could agree with that. I did want to ask you about one man you mentioned that was in the book that I thought was kind of interesting. Robert Keith Packard. He had the Camp Auschwitz shirt on, and Nancy Pelosi freaked out about it. So you said he got one of the lightest prison sentences. I think it was 75 days.
Yeah.
And it kind of seemed odd that someone that was so brazen with Nazi symbolism, and especially since the left loves to accuse of that anyway, do you think maybe he was involved somehow and that's why he got a lighter sentence? Like he was there to rile people up? That just seemed really strange he would get the lightest sentence.
Yeah, and his as he explained, his motives were very murky. Could not understand. He's wearing a Camp Auschwitz. It says Camp Auschwitz, right? Now, plus when you look at that, does that mean you are protesting Auschwitz or you are celebrating Auschwitz? That's not clear either. I think he was a plant. Same with the guy with the Confederate flag. There was one Confederate flag, right? And you see it from the news media perspective, it's in every other photo. When you're looking at hours and hours of video, you don't even see it. You see it once, then you don't see it again for another hour, 2 hours. I saw one gay pride flag there, right? I never saw a gay pride flag in any of the media accounts of the January 6th. So they were very selective in their imagery, and the Camp Auschwitz guy was like, he's wearing a T-shirt or something. It's 30 degrees outside. I was very suspicious of that whole thing.
When you do look at the footage, because I've watched quite a bit of it, you're expecting to see just regular type of middle America white people, because they make you think those are the only people that really vote for Trump.
Right.
And you see all sorts of races and ethnicities. I've seen they don't show that part, which I guess is what irritates me. They make you think it's these racist white people that hate everybody that showed up. And then you look at it and it's like, no, this is as eclectic blend of people as you'd found at a Bernie Sanders rally or anything.
Right. I mean, and there was a large Asian contingent there also. And there are many Hispanics. There were one of the women I almost profiled was Islamic, but I just couldn't get enough information on her, and it was just a little elusive. In fact, she would have been the only one I was profiling just to make a point, and I decided that wasn't what I wanted to do.
Do you think the truth about January 6th will ever come out and become so evident that most Americans will realize what really happened that day? Or is it always just going to be relegated? Soon. You think so?
Yeah, sooner than later.
Right. Do you think even the left will be like, oh, wow, I was hoodwinked and fooled?
No. I mean, some people on the left will say that, but most of them, stick to their fantasies long beyond the shelf life of those fantasies, right? They still believe that, Trump was peed on by Russian prostitutes. I mean, they'll cling to these beliefs really until their dying days, right?
True. I want to ask you one question. The very beginning of your book, you say that you call January 6th the greatest mass injustice against American citizens since Japanese internment.
Uh-huh.
For someone maybe listening to this who is maybe far left and really does think January 6th was equivalent to Pearl Harbor, like Kamala Harris does, in one brief, maybe elevator pitch, soundbite, how would you convince someone that it was as serious as the Japanese internment camps? Like, how would you back that up to someone in a brief, 30-second way for someone to really penetrate their brain?
Well, when you arrest nearly 1,600 people and imprison half of them for crimes, and 90% of the cases no worse than walking around inside the Capitol and taking selfies, that is just an extravagant injustice. Whatever you say, what you will about Japanese internment, and that's been misinterpreted, they were treated well once they got to their camps. They had softball tournaments and volleyball games and, various chess clubs. And you didn't get that in the gulags of Washington, D.C. This is just a clarification point on the Japanese internment. They weren't forcibly interned. They were forcibly evacuated from certain zones on the West Coast. If they had relatives in Ohio, they could go. They just had to get out of those zones. Most people had nowhere to go, and thus the camps. Hawaii, which was heavily Japanese, there was no internment because there's no place to put people or for people to go. They just had to live with that. It was an overreaction, but it was engineered by FDR, their hero, and approved by a liberal Supreme Court. So, be careful about judging history, in other words.
I love this phrase you used in the book. You said that the January 6th Commission was as partisan and gutless as the people who commissioned it. I was wondering if you could walk us through some of the flaws of the commission, some of the big blunders of it, why it was such a bad idea, why it was just such a stupid concept in the first place. Like, for people that don't know, people treat that commission almost like it's the Bible and everything in there is true.
No, I mean, it was a classic. It was reminiscent of the Moscow show trials, obviously without the same, we didn't kill 100,000 people, but it was all done for show. So no Republican that the Republicans wanted on that commission was allowed on that commission. You had only the two stooge Republicans, Kinzinger and Liz Cheney. I've read the major swaths of the commission report. Every time I cross-checked a fact that I could verify with what was in the J6 committee report, it proved to be false or misleading or exaggerated. They leave out major things. They leave out the killing of Ashli Babbit. Michael Byrd doesn't get his name mentioned. Roseanne Boylan doesn't get her name mentioned, right? And then once they wanted to go public with their information, they hired the president of ABC, a guy named James Goldston, to produce this highly orchestrated dog and pony show that was absolutely selectively edited to present this insurrection. Just the very use of the word insurrection is indicative of how warped the whole committee was. They knew it was an insurrection, and but they went ahead and they presented it like and it got media reviews all around the world. They said, "Boy, this is even better than Game of Thrones." You know, like these nightly showings of various people getting beat up and all. I'll just give you an example of how dishonest it was. No police officers were killed on January 6th. And they would go on to say there were 5 killed as a result of January 6th. None were. Then they say 1,400 policemen were injured. The worst injury, and the New York Times actually inadvertently spilled this in an article they wrote on the listing all the injuries of the people brutally attacked by the protesters. The worst injury was someone lost the tip of their pinky finger, right? Now, I would hate to lose the tip of my pinky finger, but I can't imagine a protester coming in with like a wire cutters and clipping off the tips of pinky finger. Probably got it caught in something or not. You know how that happens. It hurts. I wouldn't be pleased. But that was the worst one. And then they said someone might have suffered a concussion. And then you had these lying cops like Officer Harry Dunn and who were just, and Michael Byrd, my God, they lied about everything because they were encouraged to lie. And the bolder the lie, the bigger the lie, the more powerful the January 6th narrative that the Liz Cheneys of the world wanted to spin for God knows what reason.
Okay. It's kind of like that quote from Hitler, tell a lie loud enough and long enough, people believe it. And that's just kind of what they were doing, I guess, with the commission.
Yeah, they went for the big lie. And the big lie began with the word insurrection. And actually, the big lie began with the big lie. So any protest, I mean, they did this in lockstep. Any protest of the election, and you'd have to be a fool not to protest the election, was labeled the big lie, right? And what I really admired about Trump on his NBC interview was when she said, for the sake of unity, why are you willing to concede the 2020 election? He goes, no, why should I? And then she says, well, you had control of the White House and DOJ, and now the Democrats did, so why didn't they do it this time? And he said, too big to rig, right? Too big to rig. They repeated himself. There was too much of a margin for them to steal the election, and they didn't have the cover of COVID and the 60 million votes delivered by a post office that had been threatened with its very existence if Trump were to win the election.
Really interesting. I appreciate your time. Where would you like to tell people they can get your book? Maybe what are you going to write about next? What can we look forward to for your next book?
I would say I would recommend, there's various places you can get the book, but Ashli, The Untold Story of the Women of January 6th, I would recommend Amazon because that's where publishers keep score. So nowadays, it used to be the New York Times bestseller list. Now it's Amazon. And I would say also, I have a Substack, just Jack Cashill Substack. And, I write for various publications and more information about me, et cetera, is at Cashill.com, my website, CASHILL.com. So, Courtney, but I appreciate you have great questions and you really know your stuff. Always fun to talk to someone who comes in informed, so anytime.
Now that you know where we've been, Find out where we're going. Tune in to Ladies Love Politics, where you can stay informed without going insane.